3 times. They rejected him 3 times. They looked at his business plan, his credit history, his projections, and they said no. Not because the numbers were wrong. The numbers were right. They said no because of something that had nothing to do with numbers at all. What they never considered was what a man does with a no that has nothing to do with numbers. 14 months. 3 visits to the same building, the same floor, the same desk. 3 times James Caldwell sat across from a loan officer at First Continental Bank and presented his case with the careful, thorough precision of a man who had done his homework and knew it. 3 times he watched the same process unfold, the polite attention, the professional questions, the review period that stretched longer than it should have, the letter that arrived afterward with the language that all rejection letters use, the language designed to sound like business when it is something else entirely. He was not a man who gave up easily. He was not a man who gave up at all. He had learned, across 44 years of being told what he could and couldn't do, that the distance between no and yes was not fixed, that it could be traveled, that the people who said no were not the final authority on what was possible. What First Continental Bank did not know, on the afternoon of that third rejection, was that James Caldwell had already begun making other plans. Plans that did not require their approval. Plans that would, in exactly 364 days, bring him back to that building. Not as an applicant, but as the man who owned it. Stay with us. Because this is not just a story about a bank or a loan or a business. This is a story about what happens when you take every no you've ever been given and build something with it that no one can take away. Asterisk James Caldwell was born in 1979 in a neighborhood in Memphis, Tennessee that the city planners had drawn their maps around, rather than through, one of those places that exists in the geography of a city, without existing in its imagination, that produces people of enormous capability and receives in return the specific, grinding indifference of institutions that have decided, without ever quite saying so, that some places and some people are not worth the investment. His father, Robert Caldwell, worked at jobs for most of James's childhood, days at a loading dock on the river, evenings maintaining the grounds of a private school 3 miles from the neighborhood, whose students he would never meet. Robert was a quiet man, not given to speeches or declarations, who expressed his values through the consistency of his presence and the specificity of his attention. He noticed things. He noticed when James was struggling and when James was coasting, and he treated both conditions with the same response, which was a conversation at the kitchen table that began with a question and ended with James understanding something he hadn't understood before. His mother, Gloria Caldwell, was a different kind of force. Where Robert was quiet, Gloria was vivid, a woman who filled whatever room she was in with the specific energy of someone who has decided that life is too short for smallness. She worked as a bookkeeper for 3 small businesses in the neighborhood, doing their accounts by hand in ledgers she kept in a cabinet above the refrigerator. And she had a gift for numbers that she passed to James with directness, of someone who knows exactly what they are giving and why it matters. Numbers don't lie, she told him when he was 8 years old, sitting beside her at the kitchen table while she worked through a client's quarterly accounts. People lie. Systems lie. But numbers, if you read them right, they always tell you the truth. James had taken this seriously. He had taken most things his mother said seriously, because she had the quality of a person whose words had been tested against reality and had consistently held up. He became the kind of student who excelled in mathematics not because it came easily. It did come easily, but that wasn't the reason, but because he understood, at some level that predated full articulation, that numerical literacy was a form of power, that the ability to read a balance sheet, to understand a cash flow projection, to see the story that numbers were telling, was a tool that could be used to build things. He wanted to build things. He had always wanted to build things. He graduated from his neighborhood high school in 1997, not at the top of his class, because the top of his class had been a young woman named Denise Washington, whose mathematical ability was so extraordinary that James, who was himself exceptional, could only admire it from a respectful distance, but close enough to the top. that his transcript reflected what he was capable of. He received a partial scholarship to a state university 2 hours away. His parents covered the rest with savings accumulated over years of deliberate, disciplined sacrifice. He studied business. He chose business the way some people choose medicine or law, not as a profession, but as a calling, with the specific conviction of someone who has identified the exact instrument through which they intend to do their work in the world. He was a serious student. He read beyond the curriculum. He spent his summers working, retail his freshman year, an accounting firm his sophomore year, a small property management company his junior and senior years where he learned, in the practical, unglamorous detail of actual operations, what it meant to run a business from the inside. He graduated in 2001 and returned to Memphis. This was a decision that some of his classmates found puzzling. He had options, had received offers from companies in larger cities, had the grades and the references to go anywhere he chose, but to James, it was not a complicated decision. He had grown up watching his neighborhood be underserved by every institution that was supposed to serve it. He had watched businesses close because their owners couldn't access capital, had watched buildings deteriorate because their owners couldn't access loans for renovation, had watched the particular, compounding cycle of disinvestment play out in real time across the landscape of his childhood. He intended to interrupt that cycle. He intended to do it from the inside, by building businesses in the neighborhood that the neighborhood needed, that employed people from the neighborhood, that kept money circulating in a community that had been systematically drained of it for decades. He started small. He had no capital beyond his savings and a small amount borrowed from his parents. Money they gave him without condition and without drama, the way they had always given him what he needed. He opened a bookkeeping and tax preparation service in a rented office on a commercial strip that had seen better decades. He charged fair prices, did excellent work, and built his client base through the oldest and most reliable marketing strategy available, which is being genuinely good at what you do and letting the people you serve tell others. Within 3 years, he had 12 employees and a client roster that had outgrown his original office. He moved to a larger space. He expanded his services. He began to see, in the pattern of his clients' needs, the shape of the larger thing he wanted to build. What his clients needed, what the neighborhood needed, was not just bookkeeping. It was capital, access to the financing that allowed small businesses to grow, to hire, to survive the inevitable rough patches that all businesses encountered. His clients were repeatedly running into the same wall he would eventually run into himself. The wall of institutions that had decided, through whatever combination of explicit policy and implicit bias, that certain borrowers and certain neighborhoods were too risky to invest in. He began to educate himself about banking, not casually, not as an observer, but with the thoroughness of a man who intends to operate in a space and understands that operating in a space requires knowing it completely. He read everything he could find. He took courses. He sought out mentors, older business people who had navigated the financial system and could describe its terrain from experience, and he began to save, systematically, deliberately, with the specific patience of someone who is building toward a goal that requires more than they currently have and is willing to take the time the goal requires. By 2012, James Caldwell was 43 years old. He had 11 years of operating history, a profitable business, a growing team, and a plan. The plan was to open a small business lending operation, not a full bank, not yet, but a community development financial institution, a CDFI, that could provide the kind of capital access that traditional banks had consistently refused to provide to borrowers in underserved communities. To do it, he needed a loan, a significant one, enough to capitalize the operation to the level required by regulators, enough to establish the reserves that responsible lending required, enough to build the infrastructure that the institution would need to function. He walked into First Continental Bank on a Tuesday morning in March of 2012 with a business plan that had taken him 8 months to develop, and that was, by any objective measure, thorough, realistic, and well supported. He sat down across from a loan officer named Sandra Pierce. He presented his case. Sandra Pierce listened. She asked professional questions. She reviewed the documents he had brought. She told him the application would go to the review committee and that he would hear back. Within 30 days, he heard back in 22. The answer was no. The first rejection letter arrived on a Thursday. James read it at his desk. In the office that had grown from a single rented room to a suite of 5, surrounded by the evidence of 11 years of building something from nothing. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. It cited insufficient collateral and unproven market demand for the proposed lending operation. It expressed, in the careful language of institutional rejection, something that translated roughly to, "We don't think this will work, and we don't think you are who you say you are." James folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. Then he opened his laptop and began revising his business plan. He spent the next 4 months strengthening every element that the rejection had identified as a weakness. He secured additional collateral through a property transaction he had been planning anyway, which he accelerated specifically for this purpose. He commissioned a market study from an independent research firm that documented, with the specificity that data provides, the unmet demand for small business lending in the Memphis neighborhoods his institution would serve. He added 3 years of additional financial projections, stress-tested against multiple economic scenarios. He updated his personal financial statement. He obtained letters of support from 12 community organizations for local government officials and 2 university economists who had studied community development finance. He returned to First Continental Bank in July of 2012. This time he met with a senior loan officer named David Marsh, who had been in the position for 19 years and who received James's revised application with the professional attentiveness of a man who has processed thousands of applications and has developed, over those thousands, a set of instincts about which ones will clear the committee and which ones won't. David Marsh asked thorough questions. He spent 90 minutes with James, going through the plan section by section, asking the kind of questions that suggested genuine engagement, rather than performative due diligence. James answered each one with the precision and depth of a man who had spent for months making sure he could answer every possible question with precision and depth. At the end of the meeting, David told him the application looked strong and that he would personally present it to the committee. The second rejection letter arrived 31 days later. It cited market risk and regulatory uncertainty in the CDFI space. It was 3 paragraphs long and expressed in somewhat warmer language than the first letter, essentially the same message. James read it at his desk. He folded it and placed it in the top drawer beside the first one. Then he picked up the phone and called his mother, Gloria. Caldwell listened to her son describe the second rejection with the patience of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that certain roads require more than one attempt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are the numbers right?" she asked. "Yes," James said. "Then go back," she said. He went back. He spent 6 months this time, 6 months of additional preparation, additional documentation, additional evidence. He met with a regulatory attorney who specialized in CDFI formation and obtained a detailed legal opinion on the regulatory landscape, directly addressing the committee's stated concern about regulatory uncertainty. He arranged a meeting with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta's Community Development Office and obtained a letter from them affirming the viability of the lending model he proposed. He added 2 board members to his proposed institution, a retired bank examiner and a former senior official from the FDIC whose credentials were specifically designed to answer any remaining question about regulatory competence. He returned to First Continental Bank in February of 2013. This time he requested a meeting with the bank's chief lending officer, a woman named Margaret Hollister, who had been in her position for 11 years and who was, by the bank's own description, the final internal authority on commercial lending decisions before the board. Margaret Hollister received him in a corner office on the 14th floor. She was professional, precise, and gave no indication during the 90-minute meeting of what she was thinking, beyond the questions she asked, which were pointed and intelligent, and which James answered with the full depth of 2 years of preparation. At the end of the meeting, Margaret Hollister shook his hand and told him the committee would be in touch. The third rejection letter arrived 28 days later. It was the shortest of the three, one paragraph, and it cited, in language so vague as to be almost content-free, a mismatch between the proposed institution's risk profile and the bank's current lending priorities. James read it at his desk. He read it twice. Then he folded it and placed it in the top drawer with the other two. He sat for a long moment looking at the drawer. He thought about his mother's ledgers above the refrigerator, about numbers that don't lie, about the fact that his numbers had been right every time, demonstrably, documentably right, and that the answer had been no 3 times anyway. He thought about what that meant, not about the bank, not about the individuals who had reviewed his application, but about the system, about the gap between what the system said it was doing and what it was actually doing, about the specific, structural, thoroughly documented reality that black-owned businesses received a fraction of the small business lending that comparable white-owned businesses received, not because the businesses were less viable, but because the system that assessed viability had been built by people who did not have his face in mind when they built it. He had known this before the first rejection. He had known it intellectually, the way you know things you have read about and studied but not yet personally encountered at full. Force thought he knew it differently now. He closed the drawer. He picked up the phone. He called his attorney, a man named Franklin Webb who had been his legal counsel for 8 years, and who had the specific quality of a lawyer who combines technical excellence with genuine strategic intelligence. Franklin. James said, "I need to talk to you about a different kind of plan." Franklin Webb arrived at James's office the following morning. He sat across the desk in the chair that loan officers and clients and partners had sat in across 9 years of meetings, and he listened while James talked for 45 minutes without interruption. When James finished, Franklin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know what you're describing is going to take everything you have." "I know," James said, "and it's going to take longer than a year to do it right." "I know," James said, "but I'm not doing it in a year. I'm doing it in the time it takes to do it right." Franklin nodded slowly. "Then let's talk about how to structure it." The meeting lasted for hours. By the time Franklin left, James Caldwell had the outline of a plan that was significantly more ambitious than a community lending institution. It was a plan to acquire a bank. The plan was not simple. James had known from the beginning that it would not be simple, and he had made his peace with that before he began. Acquiring a bank, even a small, struggling community bank, required regulatory approval, significant capital, and the kind of patience that most people, when they imagine themselves capable of it, discover they are not actually capable of when the timeline extends into years rather than months. James was capable of it. He had been practicing patience his entire life. The first thing he did, in the weeks following his conversation with Franklin, was conduct a thorough assessment of the banking landscape in Memphis and its surrounding region. He was looking for a specific kind of institution, a community bank, small enough to be acquirable with the capital he could assemble, large enough to be meaningful, and, critically, struggling enough that its current owners would be receptive to a serious offer. He found 3 candidates within 60 days. Of the 3, one stood out immediately. Riverside Community Bank had been founded in 1987 by a group of local business people who had, in that era, shared a vision not entirely unlike James's own, a locally owned institution that would serve the community rather than extract from it. For its first 15 years, it had done exactly that. Then it had gone through a series of leadership changes, made some lending decisions that turned out poorly during the 2008 financial crisis, and found itself by 2013 in the specific condition of a bank that is technically solvent, but operationally distressed, profitable enough to stay open, to burdened by bad loans and depleted reserves to grow. Its current president, a man named Gerald Patterson, had been brought in 2 years earlier to stabilize the institution. Gerald was competent and well-intentioned and honest about the situation, which was that Riverside Community Bank needed either a significant capital infusion or a buyer, and that the capital infusion had not materialized through the channels they had pursued. James arranged a meeting with Gerald Patterson through Franklin, framing it initially as an exploratory conversation about potential partnership. They met at a restaurant in Midtown Memphis on a Thursday afternoon, and James spent the first 30 minutes listening, really listening, the way he had always listened when he needed to understand something, with his full attention and without the impatience of a person who already knows what they want to say. Gerald Patterson was 63 years old and had spent his career in community banking. He loved the institution he was running. He was also realistic about its situation, in the way that honest people are realistic about difficult circumstances, clearly, without flinching, without the kind of defensive minimization that makes problems harder to solve. James asked questions. Gerald answered them. By the end of the meeting, James had a clear picture of the institution's condition, its loan portfolio, its capital ratios, its regulatory standing, its staffing, its community relationships. The picture was complicated, as all real pictures of real institutions are, but it was not hopeless. It was, in fact, something that James could see a path through. He did not make an offer that day. He went home and spent 2 weeks running numbers. Not the surface numbers, the ones that told the obvious story, but the deep numbers, the ones underneath, the ones that told you what the institution could become with the right capital, and the right strategy and the right leadership. What the deep numbers told James was that Riverside Community Bank, properly recapitalized and strategically repositioned, could become exactly the kind of institution he had been trying to build from scratch. It already had the regulatory standing, the community relationships, the operational infrastructure. It needed capital, direction, and someone who understood what it was supposed to be. He knew what it was supposed to be. He had known for 20 years. He went back to Franklin. They spent a month developing the acquisition structure, the specific legal and financial architecture of how James would buy the bank. It required assembling a consortium of investors, because James alone did not have enough capital to complete the acquisition. He spent the following 3 months having conversations with potential investors, a mix of individuals, family offices, and community development organizations who shared his vision for what the bank could become. He raised the capital in 4 months. Not easily. There were conversations that went nowhere, commitments that were made and then withdrawn, moments when the whole structure seemed to be in danger of collapsing, under the weight of its own complexity. But James had been building things under difficult conditions his entire life, and he understood that the difficulty was not a sign that the thing was wrong. It was just the price of the thing being reeled out. By the spring of 2014. He had what he needed. The regulatory approval process took 6 months. The Federal Reserve and the FDIC both reviewed the proposed acquisition, the acquirer's background, the business plan, the capital structure, the proposed leadership team. James cooperated with every element of the review with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 2 years preparing his business, planned for a loan application, and understood that regulatory processes rewarded documentation. He hired a regulatory attorney with 30 years of bank acquisition experience. He hired a chief financial officer with a background in community development banking. He assembled a board of directors that combined financial expertise, community knowledge, and regulatory credibility in proportions that reflected exactly the kind of institution he intended to run. The approval came in October of 2014. James Caldwell was cleared to acquire Riverside Community Bank, which would be renamed Caldwell Community Bank upon completion of the transaction. The closing was scheduled for a Tuesday in November. James chose the date deliberately. He wanted it to be a Tuesday, the same day of the week as the morning he had first walked into First Continental Bank. With his business plan 2.5 years earlier, on the Monday before the closing, James opened the top drawer of his desk and removed the 3 rejection letters. He read them in order, first, second, third, slowly, giving each one the attention it deserved. Then he placed them in a manila envelope, sealed it, and put it in his briefcase. He had a plan for those letters. He would use them one more time. The closing took place at the offices of Franklin Webb's law firm, in a conference room on the 11th floor with a view of the Mississippi River. then on a clear November morning looked like something from a painting, wide and gray-brown, and moving with the slow, enormous authority of water that has been moving in the same direction. For longer than anyone in the room could fully imagine, James arrived early. He always arrived early. He stood at the window for a few minutes before the others came in, looking at the river, thinking about his father loading cargo on its banks, and his mother keeping accounts above the refrigerator and the neighborhood that had produced him, and that he was, in a few hours, going to have the institutional means to serve in the way it deserved to be served. The closing process itself was long and detailed, as all significant legal transactions are, dozens of documents to be reviewed and signed, representations and warranties to be made, conditions to be confirmed, funds to be transferred. James's legal team and Gerald Patterson's team worked through it methodically, page by page, with the focused patience of people who understand that the details of a transaction like this are not formalities but foundations. Gerald Patterson sat across the table from James for most of the closing. James had come to understand over the course of their conversations, a man of genuine integrity, someone who had run his institution with care and who was handing it over not with resentment, but with something closer to relief. The relief of a person who has been trying to hold something together and has found someone he trusts to carry it forward. At one point during a break in the proceedings, while the attorneys were conferring in a corner of the room, Gerald turned to James and said quietly, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," James said. "Why a bank? You could have done a lot of things with the capital you raised. Why this?" James thought about the question, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give Gerald the real answer, not the version of it that sounded good in a press release. "Because the bank is where the no happens," James said. "Everything else, the businesses that don't open, the buildings that don't get renovated, the neighborhoods that don't recover, it all traces back to where the capital decision gets made. If you change the capital decision, you change everything downstream." He paused. "I've been on the wrong side of that decision 3 times. I wanted to be on the other side of it." Gerald nodded slowly. "First Continental," he said. It was not a question. He had heard the story through the network of Memphis banking, as James had expected he would. "Yes," James said. "Their loss," Gerald said simply. The final documents were signed at 2:47 p.m. Franklin Webb's assistant gathered them into a neat stack, confirmed the fund transfer had cleared, and looked up with the particular expression of someone who has just completed something significant and knows it. "Congratulations, Mr. Caldwell," Franklin said. "You own a bank." James looked at the river for a moment. Then he reached into his briefcase and removed the manila envelope. The next morning, James Caldwell arrived at Caldwell Community Bank, his bank, the institution that carried his name and his intent, at 7:15 a.m. The staff knew he was coming. Gerald Patterson had prepared them for the transition, had spent the final weeks of his tenure ensuring that everyone who worked at the bank understood who James was and what he was building and why they should want to be part of it. What the staff had not been prepared for, what no one had told them, was what James intended to do in his first hour as the bank's owner. He gathered everyone in the main banking floor. All 23 employees of Caldwell Community Bank stood in a rough semicircle around him, some in their professional attire, some still putting on their name badges, all of them looking at him with the curious, slightly uncertain attention of people meeting their new leader for the first time. James looked at them for a moment before he spoke. "Good morning," he said. "My name is James Caldwell. This is my bank now, and I want to start by telling you why I built it." He told them about his mother's ledgers, about the neighborhood, about the businesses he had watched fail not because they were bad businesses, but because they couldn't get capital, about the plan he had brought to First Continental Bank 2.5 years earlier. In the second visit, and the third, he reached into his briefcase and removed the manila envelope. He opened it and removed the 3 rejection letters, holding them up so the room could see them. 3 times, he said. 3 thorough, documented, well-supported applications. 3 no's. He looked at the letters for a moment. "I kept these because I knew I would need them someday. not as proof of what was done wrong, as a reminder of why we have to do it right. He walked to the wall beside the bank's main entrance. The wall that, under Gerald Patterson's tenure, had held a generic landscape print in a frame, and he removed the print. He had brought something to replace it. It was a simple frame, glass-fronted, containing the 3 rejection letters arranged side by side. Below them, a single line of text that James had written himself. "This is why we say yes." He hung it on the wall. He stepped back and looked at it. "Every person who walks through that door and sits across from one of you," James said, turning back to his staff, "is bringing us something. A plan, a dream, a need. Our job is to see it clearly, to assess it honestly, and to say yes whenever the numbers support a yes, regardless of what that person looks like or where they come from." He paused. "We are going to make mistakes. All banks make mistakes. But we are never going to make the mistake of saying no to a yes." The room was very quiet. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone began to applaud. It spread quickly, the way things spread when they express something that people have been feeling and have not had a way to say. James Caldwell stood in his bank and listened to it and thought about his mother, about her voice telling him that numbers don't lie, about the top drawer of his desk, now empty of the letters that hung on the wall behind him, about the neighborhood outside the bank's windows, where the first appointments of the day were already being scheduled, where the first conversations about capital and possibility and yes were already in the minds of the people who would walk through that door. Beginning. Margaret Hollister found out on a Wednesday morning, the same way most people in Memphis banking found out, through the industry newsletter that landed in her inbox every week with the particular reliability of bad news and trade gossip. The headline was straightforward: "Caldwell completes Riverside acquisition. Renames institution Caldwell Community Bank." She read the article twice. She set her coffee down. She looked out the window of her 14th floor corner office at the Memphis skyline and sat with what she was feeling for a long moment before she tried to name it. Margaret Hollister was 57 years old and had been chief lending officer at First Continental Bank for 11 years. She was, by the measures her industry used, successful. She had a record of sound lending decisions, a team that performed consistently, and a reputation for rigor that was generally regarded as an asset. She was the kind of professional who had built her position through competence and had maintained it through the same. She was also the person who had conducted the final meeting with James Caldwell before his 3rd rejection. The 90-minute conversation on the 14th floor, the handshake, the "we'll be in touch." She had presented his application to the committee. She had delivered the committee's decision. She had believed, at the time, that the decision was defensible. The committee had cited market risk and regulatory uncertainty, and she had agreed with those assessments and had said so in the meeting where the decision was made. She had not been the only voice in that room. She had not been the loudest voice, but she had been the chief lending officer, and the chief lending officer's voice carried weight, and she had used that weight in a particular direction. Now she sat in her office reading about the man she had rejected acquiring a bank. She thought about the business plan. She had read it carefully. She always read applications carefully. It was a point of professional pride, and she remembered it, not in every detail, but in its overall quality, which had been high. The plan had been thorough. The market analysis had been credible. The financial projections had been realistic. The regulatory concern had been real, but it had also been manageable. And James Caldwell had addressed it directly in the documentation he had submitted. She thought about the committee meeting where the 3rd application had been reviewed. She thought about the conversation around the table, about the language that had been used, risk profile, lending priorities, and about what she had and hadn't said in that room. She had not argued against the rejection. She could have. She had the standing to push back, to make the case that the application's merits outweighed the committee's concerns. She had not done that. She had not done it because doing it would have required a kind of effort that went against the grain of the room, and she had made the calculation, consciously or not. She was honest enough with herself now to admit she wasn't sure, that the effort was not worth making. for this particular application from this particular applicant. She sat with that for a long time. The phone rang. She let it go to voicemail. The phone rang again. She let that go to . She picked up the newsletter and read the article a third time, more slowly. It described James Caldwell's background, his 11 years in business services, his community roots, his vision for the institution he was building. It quoted him speaking about the bank's mission. It mentioned, in the article's final paragraph, that he had previously sought conventional financing for his lending operation and had been turned down by multiple institutions before pursuing the acquisition route. Multiple institutions. She was one of those institutions. She was, specifically, the institution whose rejection had been the last before he changed his approach. She closed the newsletter. She opened her calendar. She looked at the day's schedule, meetings, reviews, a lunch with a colleague from another bank. She looked at the schedule for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone and called her assistant. "Clear my afternoon," she said. "I need to make a visit." She arrived at Caldwell Community Bank at 2:15 p.m., having called ahead through James's assistant to request 15 minutes of his time. She did not explain why. She simply said it was a professional call and that she would appreciate the meeting. If he was willing, he was willing. She was shown to his office, a corner room, modest in its furnishings, with a view of a street that she recognized as being in a neighborhood she did not often have. Cause to visit. On the wall beside the office door, visible through the glass, hung a framed display. She paused to look at it as she waited to be shown in 3 letters. She recognized the first Continental Bank letterhead on the third one immediately. The door opened. James Caldwell rose from his desk as she entered. He was exactly as she remembered him from their meeting, measured, contained, with the specific quality of attentiveness that she had noticed in the original meeting, and had found, she realized now, slightly disorienting, because it did not fit the category she had put him in. "Ms. Hollister," he said. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for seeing me," she said. She sat in the chair across from his desk. She looked at him directly. "I'll say what I came to say without preamble, because I think you deserve that." He waited. "I reviewed your third application personally," she said. "I was in the committee meeting when the decision was made. I didn't argue for approval when I could have. And I've been sitting with that since I read about the acquisition this morning." She paused. "I don't know with certainty what would have happened if I had pushed back. Maybe the committee would have overruled me anyway. Maybe not. What I know is that I didn't try, and that I should have." James looked at her for a long moment. His expression was the same she remembered, quiet, assessing, giving nothing away unnecessarily. "Why didn't you?" he asked, simply, without accusation. Margaret considered the question with the honesty it required. "Because it would have taken effort I wasn't willing to expend," she said. "Because the room was moving in a particular direction, and I moved with it instead of against it." She paused. "And because, and I want to be honest with you about this even though it is uncomfortable to say, I think I underestimated you, not your plan. Your plan was strong. I mean you. I think I applied a standard to my assessment of your likelihood of success that I would not have applied to a different applicant with the same plan." The room was very quiet. "I appreciate you saying that," James said finally. "It's an honest thing to say. It's a true thing," Margaret said. "Whether it's brave or not I leave to others to judge." She left 20 minutes later. They had talked, really talked, the way people talk when the performance requirement has been removed, and only the thing itself remains, about the lending process, about implicit bias in credit assessment, about what institutions could do differently and what individuals within institutions could do differently. She had offered nothing material. She had not come to offer anything material. She had come because she believed that the honest acknowledgement of wrong, made directly to the person wronged, was a thing that mattered regardless of its practical consequences. She was not sure she had always believed this. She believed it now. Walking back to her car, she passed the bank's main entrance and looked through the glass at the framed display on the wall. Beside the door, the 3 letters, the line of text below them. "This is why we say yes." She stood on the sidewalk and read it. A man walking past glanced at her, a woman in a business suit, standing still on a Memphis sidewalk, reading a sign in a bank window. He walked on. She stood there a moment longer. Then she walked to her car and drove back to her office and spent the rest of the afternoon doing something she had not done in 11 years of lending decisions, which was pulling a random sample of rejected applications from the past 3 years and reviewing them with a specific and uncomfortable question in mind. She would not finish that review for 2 weeks. What she found when she finished it would take considerably longer to sit with, and longer still to do something about. But she began it that afternoon, on a Wednesday in November, because beginning it was the thing she could do. And she had decided, sitting in James Caldwell's office, that doing the thing you can do is not optional. Robert Caldwell was 71 years old and had retired from the loading docks 7 years earlier, with a back that required careful management and a sense of satisfaction that did not. He spent his days in the house where James had grown up, his wife Gloria beside him. The neighborhood outside the windows both familiar and changed. The oak trees in the front yard significantly larger than they had been when they planted them, and significantly more beautiful. He found out about the bank the way he found out about everything James did from James, directly, on the phone, in a conversation that began with the same opening it always began with, "Hey, Dad. Hey, son. How are you?" "Good. Better than good, actually." Robert could hear something in James's voice. Not excitement exactly. James had always been too controlled for excitement to fully surface in his voice, but a quality of fullness, of completeness, that Robert recognized as the sound of his son having arrived somewhere he had been heading for. Long time. James told him everything. The closing, the staff meeting, the letters on the wall. Robert listened without interrupting, which was how he had always listened, because he had learned early in James's life that his son thought better when he was heard than when he was responded to, and that the best thing a father could offer a son who was figuring things out was the full, unperformative gift of attention. When James finished, Robert was quiet for a moment. Gloria, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. She was always at the kitchen table in the afternoons, the leisure habits of a lifetime having become simply the habit of sitting at the table with something to read, looked up at his expression and set down her book. "What happened?" she asked. Robert held up one finger. Into the phone he said, "James, the letters on the wall." "Yes," James said. "That was your mother's idea," Robert said. "She doesn't know it yet, but it was." There was a pause. Then James laughed, the specific laugh that Robert had been listening to for 44 years. The one that arrived without warning and changed the quality of the air around it, put her on. James said. Robert held the phone across the table to Gloria, who took it with the expression of a woman who has been married long enough to know that when her husband hands her the phone without explanation, whatever is about to happen is something she will want to be sitting down for. James told her about the bank, about the letters, about the line of text he had written and placed beneath them. Gloria Caldwell listened to her son describe the thing he had built with a particular quality of attention that mothers bring to the accomplishments of their children, not just hearing the facts, but hearing everything underneath the facts. The years of work and discipline and refusal to accept the limitations others had tried to impose. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the voice she used when something was simply and completely true and required no elaboration, "Numbers don't lie." "No," James said. "They don't, and you always read them right. You taught me how." She handed the phone back to Robert without saying anything else, because there was nothing else to say, and stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the street, where James had grown up, at the neighborhood that had produced him and that he was now, with the institution he had built, going to serve. Robert finished the call. He set the phone on the table. He looked at his wife at the window. He hung the rejection letters on the wall, Robert said. Gloria nodded, still looking out the window. "Good," she said. They sat in the quiet of the afternoon, in the house where James had learned what he knew, in the neighborhood where everything had begun. Outside, the oak trees stood in the late light, enormous and settled and entirely themselves. Robert thought about the loading dock, about the 31 years of early mornings and late evenings and the specific physical knowledge of labor that stays in a body long after the labor stops. He thought about the savings account, the one they had opened before James was born and added to every month without exception, the one they had given James for college and that James had multiplied into something neither of them had imagined when they started putting money into it. He thought about what it meant to build something slowly, to trust the process even when the process was slow, even when the slowness was frustrating, even when the destination seemed far enough away that doubt was reasonable. He had never doubted James. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He had worried, the specific, particular worry of a parent whose child is navigating a world that is not always fair and is not always kind, but he had not doubted. There was a difference. Doubt was about whether something could be done. Worry was about what the cost of doing it might be. Robert had always believed it could be done. He had simply held his breath, across the years, about the cost. The cost had been manageable. The thing had been done. He looked at Gloria at the window. She was still looking at the street, at the neighborhood, at something Robert couldn't see from where he sat, but that he understood. Because he had been looking at the same thing for 44 years, "We did all right," he said. Gloria turned from the window. She looked at him with the expression she had worn for 47 years of marriage. The one that said, "I know exactly what you mean. And yes, we did. Yes," she said. "We did." Astor's Caldwell Community Bank opened its doors to the public on the first Monday of December 2014. James had chosen December deliberately, the end of a year, the beginning of what comes after a year, the time when people who are planning ahead are most actively planning ahead, and most in need of the resources to do it. The line outside the door that morning was longer than he had expected. Not dramatically longer. He had projected the opening day traffic carefully, because he projected everything carefully, but longer in a way that felt meaningful. People from the neighborhood, business owners who had heard about the bank through the network of community organizations. James had spent years building relationships with a few journalists, a city council member who had known James for a decade and wanted to be present for something he believed mattered. James stood at the door as it opened and welcomed the first customers impersonally. He shook hands. He learned names. He listened to the brief versions of the longer stories that people carry with them when they walk into a bank, the business they are trying to start, the building they want to renovate, the future they are trying to build for themselves and their families. He listened with his full attention. He always had. The first loan Caldwell Community Bank approved was for a woman named Diane Marshall, who had been trying to open a natural hair salon in the neighborhood for 3 years, and had been turned down twice by conventional lenders. Her business plan was solid, her credit history was adequate, and her vision for what she was building was clear and specific. The loan officer who processed her application, a young man named Marcus who had grown up 4 blocks from the bank and who James had hired specifically because he understood the community. From the inside, brought it to James's desk with a note attached, strong application. Recommend approval. James reviewed it. He approved it. He called Diane Marshall personally to tell her. She was quiet for a moment when he told her. Then she said, "I've been trying for 3 years." "I know," James said. "We're glad you kept trying." In its first year of operation, Caldwell Community Bank approved 847 small business loans totaling $43 million. 83% of those loans went to borrowers who had been turned down by at least one conventional lender. The bank's default rate at the end of the first year was 0.1%, below the industry average, which was the number that James had told his investors it would be, and which some of them had accepted with more faith than certainty. The numbers were right. They had always been right. In its second year, the bank expanded its services to include a small business technical assistance program, free consulting for loan applicants who needed help strengthening their plans before applying. James had designed the program specifically to address the gap he had identified in his own experience, the gap between a business idea that was fundamentally sound and a business plan that was documented well enough to survive an institutional review process. The program was staffed by volunteers, retired business executives, accountants, attorneys, who gave their time because James had asked them to and because what he was building was the kind of thing that made people want to give their time. Margaret Hollister was one of those volunteers. She had called James 6 months after her visit to ask if there was a role for her. He had said yes without hesitation, because he was a man who valued competence and honesty, and she had demonstrated both. And because he understood, had always understood, even in the worst of the rejection, that the goal was not punishment but correction. Not to make the people who had said no suffer for saying it, but to build something that made saying yes the obvious, natural, inevitable choice, asterisk. She worked with the Technical Assistance Program for 2 years. She was good at it, rigorous, honest, clear in her feedback, genuinely committed to helping applicants build plans that would succeed. The borrowers she worked with had a higher approval rate than the program average. She did not talk about First Continental Bank in those sessions. She did not talk about James's application or her committee meeting or the decision she hadn't argued against. She simply did the work. James saw her in the building periodically. They were always professionally warm with each other, the specific warmth of two people who have had an honest conversation and have moved forward from it without pretending it didn't happen. 3 years after Caldwell Community Bank opened, James was invited to testify before a Senate subcommittee examining access to capital for minority-owned small businesses. He flew to Washington on a Tuesday morning, always Tuesday. He had decided this was going to be his day and sat before the committee in a room that smelled of history and carpet cleaner and prepared. Specific, documented testimony. He told them about the neighborhood, about the businesses, about the 3 rejection letters. He told them about the acquisition and what the first year's numbers showed, and what the default rate suggested about the relationship between risk assessment and bias. He was specific and clear and grounded in evidence, the way his mother had taught him to be grounded in evidence, because the evidence was the thing that could not be dismissed. One of the senators on the committee, an older man who had been in his seat for 20 years and who had heard many witnesses make many arguments, leaned forward during James's testimony and asked a question that cut to the heart of it. "Mr. Caldwell," the senator said, "you were rejected 3 times by a conventional lender, and then you went out and acquired a bank and ran it with a default rate below the industry average. What does that tell us about the system?" James thought about the question for a moment. He thought about his mother's voice, about the numbers, about the letters on the wall of his bank. "It tells us," he said, "that the system was wrong. Not about everything. Systems are rarely wrong about everything, but about this specific thing, about who is a good risk and who isn't, about whose plan is credible and whose isn't. It was wrong. The numbers prove it, and the numbers don't lie." The room was quiet for a moment after he said it. Then the senator nodded and wrote something on the notepad in front of him and moved to the next question. James flew home to Memphis that evening. He arrived at the bank the following morning at 7:15, which was when he always arrived. He walked through the main banking floor, past the framed letters on the wall, through the staff who were setting up for the day, to his office with the view of the street outside. He sat down at his desk. He looked out the window at the neighborhood, his neighborhood, the one that had made him, the one he was making something for in return. The first appointment of the day was at 8 o'clock. A young woman who wanted to open a restaurant. Her plan was in a folder on his desk, flagged by Marcus with a note. Strong concept. First-time applicant. Worth your time. James opened the folder. He began to read. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. The street was filling with the ordinary morning traffic of people going about their lives, opening their businesses, walking their children to school, carrying their plans and their hopes and their needs through the December morning, toward whatever the day held. Some of them would walk through the bank's door today. Some of them would sit across from one of his loan officers and present what they had built and what they needed to take it further. Some of them would hear yes for the first time after hearing no somewhere else. James read the young woman's business plan and thought about what a yes does to a person who has been told no. He thought about Diane Marshall's salon, which he had visited 3 months after the loan closed and which was exactly what she had said it would be, full of life and skill and the specific, irreplaceable energy of someone doing exactly what they were built to do. He thought about the $43 million in the first year, and what $43 million becomes when it moves through a community, the jobs, the buildings, the families, the futures downstream of every yes. He thought about his mother's ledgers above the refrigerator, about what she had taught him about numbers, about the truth they told when you read them right. The numbers had always been right. He had always known they were right. It had taken him 2.5 years in the acquisition of a bank to prove it to anyone. Who needed proof? He had the proof now. He had it framed on the wall. And every morning, when the first customers of the day walked through the door and looked up at the 3 letters and the line of text beneath them, they knew it to dot. This is why we say yes. If James Caldwell's story moved you, share it. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been told no when you knew the answer should have been yes? What did you do with that no? Subscribe for more stories about the people who build anyway. We'll be here.